As we know, Donald Trump assumed the presidency of the United States in January 2017. Although Trump indicated many of his preferences, such as his dislike of NATO and his opposition to the Iranian nuclear deal during his campaign, one of the earliest foreign policy challenges came from the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Outside of the immediate US responses to this, other chemical challenges include the deadlock in the United Nations and the OPCW on the issue of attributing chemical attacks, and the use of nerve agents to try and kill Sergei Skripal, a former Russian spy, in the UK. I'll briefly run through these topics before handing over to Richard, who will cover US attitudes towards arms control and non-proliferation in much more detail. To try and understand the context of Trump's policy towards chemical weapons in Syria, it's worth revisiting the mixed record that Trump inherited. On one hand, the Obama administration took a clear position on the issues of chemical weapons in Syria, albeit one where the administration was mindful of the mistakes of 2003, where the US invaded Iraq based on poor intelligence. As such, one of the enduring themes of the Obama administration was its emphasis on evidence collection and the chain of custody. In August 2012, Obama declared a red line on chemical weapons use in Syria. Despite the threat of military action failing to stop chemical weapons attacks outright, the threat of the use of force after a catastrophic attack on Ghouta a year later secured the surrender of Syria's declared chemical weapons stockpile in September 2013. So after the surrender of its declared stockpile, the Syrian government effectively transitions to less lethal chemical agents such as chlorine, and crude methods such as dropping them from helicopters or attaching them to rockets. When we look at the graph in these attacks, which I should note have not been confirmed, although IHS Markit do deem these accusations to be credible, we observe a growing confidence and means refinement of these fairly crude means. In part, this comes from the fact-finding mission's inability to attribute responsibility, but there's a distinction between the severity attack and the level of response by the international community is a theme that gets consolidated under Trump. It's noteworthy that the graph covers accusations of chemical weapons attacks by non-state actors in both Iraq and Syria in this case, and non-state actors predominantly being the Islamic State. By the end of the Obama administration, we see a Syrian government that continues to use chemical weapons, albeit at what we assume would be a much lower level than otherwise would be. We see a diminished Islamic State generally, but with a group that has a severely degraded ability to launch chemical attacks within its remaining territory. Politically, however, we also see the consolidation of Russian support for Syria, both militarily and diplomatically, in the United Nations and other fora, such as the OPCW. As mentioned, one of the earliest foreign policy challenges to Trump was from the chemical weapons issues. Trump is sworn in on the 20th of January 2017, and on the 4th of April, a large-scale chemical attack takes place on the town of Khan Shaykhun. Trump issues what has been described as an emotional response, which highlighted that innocent children and innocent babies had been poisoned. According to Bob Woodward's book, Trump indeed ordered a strike on Assad, although US Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis went on to order a more measured response. 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired at Al-Shamat Air Base in Syria, aimed at Syrian fighter jets, hardened aircraft shelters, radar equipment, ammunition bunkers, sites for storing fuel, and defense systems. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster went on to clarify that none of the sites believed to be storing sarin were targeted for fear of civilian risk. The US used military action again on the 14th of April 2018, so almost a year later. So after the US attack, or the joint strike, it's notable that Trump's initial justifications didn't include appeals to the international community or upholding norms, although these were included in subsequent statements by the US government. So, just briefly on some of the other chemical issues which the Trump administration has faced. These include deadlock at the UN and a decrease in the consensus model perhaps at the OPCW. Indeed, with the politicized nature of chemical attacks, this really centers around the issue of attribution and who has the power to attribute responsibility for chemical weapons use. One of the overriding narratives on the western part is that Russia and Syria and Iran are seeking to undermine consensus and politicizing these chemical attacks by evoking the spirit of 2003, where the US invaded Iraq. They suggest these are false flag attacks, and that basically these are being orchestrated by people with malicious intent in order to undermine the Syrian government and to invite foreign intervention. Indeed, the US, France, and the UK in particular suggest an alternative explanation, which is that the chemical attacks are real, and effectively that the Syrian government continues to use chemical weapons with impunity despite its commitments to the CWC and against the taboo against chemical weapons use. This is essentially resulted in a deadlock at the United Nations, and we see at the Chemical Weapons Review Conference a very pointed speech by the United States, blaming Iran and Russia for blocking efforts.